It's that kind of food that is at the root of a lot of our cancer, coronary artery disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and so forth.
Chronic inflammation is a root cause of disease. It's so fascinating for me to be talking to someone like yourself who was way ahead of the game. Did you know about it before it came into the sort of common vernacular? And what happened there?
What first caught my attention were articles in the scientific literature in the mid-1980s that made it look as if there were commonalities in the origin of disease entities that I had been taught had nothing to do with each other, that coronary artery disease and cancer and neurodegenerative diseases, that there might be a common root there in chronic inappropriate inflammation. That is a completely new idea and hypothesis. And I have a good sense of knowing when things are right and that there's going to be evidence to support that. So I got onto that idea very early, and it excited me because if these broad categories of disease that we had previously thought had nothing in common, if in fact they have a common root, then there's a common strategy for dealing with them and reducing the risk of them. And that is by doing everything you can to contain inappropriate inflammation. There's a lot of influences on one's inflammatory status, some that you can do things about and some that you can't. One that you can do something about is exposure to environmental toxins. Secondhand tobacco smoke is a major pro-inflammatory agent, for example. But what particularly caught my attention was the possibility that dietary changes could reduce inappropriate inflammation. And I developed an anti-inflammatory diet with that in mind. And long after I began to look at this and begin writing about this, I began to see other evidence that mental emotional health was linked here as well. And the cytokine hypothesis of depression, which is a much more recent idea, to me looks much more robust than the serotonin hypothesis of depression, which has led to all the use of pharmaceutical antidepressants. And the idea that chronic inflammation and depression are linked, that's fascinating to me.
How do you describe inflammation or chronic inflammation to your patients or your students?
Well, I usually say, we all know inflammation on the surface of the body. It's local redness, heat, swelling, and pain at an area that's injured or under attack. And that although it can be uncomfortable, inflammation is the cornerstone of the body's healing response. It's how the body gets more nourishment and more immune activity to an area that needs it. But inflammation is so powerful and it's so potentially destructive that if it persists, if it escapes its limits in time and space, then it becomes destructive. And in the short term, it can lead to allergy and autoimmunity, but long term, it looks as if it increases the risk of a whole diverse range of very serious chronic diseases. I think that coronary artery disease begins as inflammation in the lining of arteries. Alzheimer's disease clearly begins as inflammation in the brain, and that's why anti-inflammatory agents like ibuprofen and turmeric have a preventive effect. And cancer is linked here too, because anything that increases inflammation also increases cell proliferation. The two are totally linked. And when cells proliferate more, the risk of malignant transformation is increased. So again, it's just fascinating that this is so different from what I was taught in medical school.
In terms of foods and this anti-inflammatory diet that you put together many years ago, I wonder if we could sort of talk about what this kind of dietary pattern looks like. Is it more about the sort of general types of foods you're eating, or can we see within that some specific?
Both. And I developed this by using the Mediterranean diet as a template because we have so much scientific evidence for that way of eating being associated with optimum health and longevity. And it's a way of eating that in no way restricts the pleasure of food, which I think is extremely important. And I tweaked that by adding Asian influences to it because I've spent a lot of time in Asian countries, and there are specific foods and beverages that particularly in Japan, China, India that I think are, very helpful. So the first rule of the anti-inflammatory, first of all, it's not a diet, it's because diets are things that we go off of. So it's an eating plan for life. And the first rule is to stop eating or greatly reduce consumption of refined, processed, and manufactured foods. I mean, that's simple. It's that kind of food being made by somebody else that is really at the root of a lot of our of these chronic illnesses in our societies, of obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and so forth. So the first step is simply to try to eliminate refined, processed, and manufactured food. And then, next is eating a variety of high quality fresh produce, especially vegetables. Fruits, yes, but fruits are often concentrated sugar sources, and I think we should be more moderate about that. But an array of vegetables with all different colors, because those are all protective compounds. I think it is good to reduce the amount of animal protein in the diet. I don't tell people to become complete vegetarians. I myself eat fish and vegetables, but I think restricting animal foods is a good idea. Increasing the consumption of plant protein in the form of legumes, soy protein, for example, using olive oil as a main cooking oil, and being very careful about the kinds of fats that you consume, making sure that you're getting omega-3 fatty acids, which are strongly anti-inflammatory, by eating oily fish, or supplements derived from algae if you don't want to eat fish. Using spices like turmeric and ginger, which are powerful anti-inflammatory agents. Tea, especially green tea, which has many helpful antioxidant properties. I've developed eating forms of carbohydrate that don't raise blood sugar quickly. I'm not anti-carb, but I think it's important to distinguish between types of carbohydrates that digest quickly, and especially products made from flour and pulverized grains, as opposed to truly whole grains that are cracked, either entire or cracked in big pieces. I have an anti-inflammatory diet pyramid, and at the very top is dark chocolate, which I think is a health food, and consumed in moderation, I think is very good for you.
The first step when you were describing that was remove or eliminate these highly processed foods. And it just makes me think of something I've been sort of contemplating a lot recently, Andrew, which is this idea that, is it more important, and I guess the question itself is artificial, but it's just, a thought experiment. Is it more important to exclude these problematic, modern, highly processed, I guess not even foods, food-like substances? Or is it more important to, I guess, we can keep those in, but add in some of these so-called, superfoods, or, your dark chocolate, your berries, those sort of things? I mean, how would you look at that sort of conundrum?
I think it is more important to reduce or eliminate the processed stuff.
Me too.
I think it is really unhealthy, and on all sorts of levels. It's the wrong fats, the wrong types of carbohydrates, not enough of the protective elements. So I guess you could make up for the protective elements by adding some of those other things back, but you're not going to take away the damage being done by the unhealthy fats and the unhealthy forms of carbohydrates and the additives.
How do you see these diet wars? And I'm really interested because you've been across this field for so many years. Something has changed, hasn't it, in the last, 10, 20 years? Like, diet is prime time now. Everyone's talking about, well, not everyone, not enough people, but a lot of people within the health space are talking about diets. There are fights going on about vegan versus carnivore versus keto versus low carb. And, I'm interested as to, how do you see all that as someone who's been across this for so long? Has anything happened to modify your view, tweak things over time, or, what's been going on there?
Well, I've seen a lot of these come and go, and I think a lot of the ones that are fashionable at the moment will go. Some of the ones that are popular, I think, are really unhealthy. I think a keto diet is extremely unhealthy, unless it's for specific use of kids with intractable seizures, for example.
Well, why do you say that? Because a lot of people, even within the health space, are describing huge benefits from a ketogenic diet. And I appreciate a ketogenic diet can be done many different ways. I mean, a lot of people can do it with lots and lots of sort of leafy green veg as well to get these phytonutrients. Right. But why is it you think it's so unhealthy?
I think these diets tend to be unhealthily low in fiber, for example. I think the restriction of carbohydrates is unhealthy. I think it fails to distinguish between better and worse forms of carbohydrate. I think beans are very healthy forms of carbohydrate. Whole grains, I think, are healthy. I think keto diet is also very unhealthy for the planet. And this is something that we all have to be concerned about today, is the environmental impact of different ways of eating. And this is, one of the strong arguments for reducing animal protein in a diet, especially beef. And keto people tend to be eating a lot of meat. And that, I think, is one of the great contributors to climate change. And we can't afford to do this anymore. So for all those reasons, I think that's not a good eating plan.
On an individual level, I'm maybe asking this because I know a lot of people will ask this question. If there's someone listening to this right now, or watching this on YouTube or whatever, somehow consuming this information, and let's say, I don't know, 3 months ago, they went on a ketogenic type diet and they're now experiencing, they've lost weight, they've got more energy, they've got better skin, they've got more focus, because this is what you hear a lot, right? So if someone is into that, is experiencing that, and then they're hearing you, someone who they really respect, say, actually, you don't think it's that helpful, how would you help that individual kind of make sense of that?
First of all, a general belief I have is that in many cases, health benefits that people experience when they change how they eat are really not directly due to the dietary change, but rather to the commitment of mental energy to doing something to improve your health. There's no way to do that experiment, but I think it's not easy for people to change how they eat. And so to do so represents a great commitment of mental energy, and that often initiates a healing response or improves health function of the body. So I think any beneficial changes that you see following a dietary change have to be assumed to be somewhat, and maybe in large part, due to that. If you want to call that a placebo response, fine. But unless we have controlled experiments to tell how much is due to the actual dietary change, it's very hard to tell. You asked also about any major changes that I've made in my thinking. A big one was that I lived through the anti-fat era in the 1970s, when we were told that dietary fat was the ultimate culprit and it was causing, heart disease and all sorts of things. And this was the era in which manufacturers made low fat and no fat products. And in that period, people got fatter, and there was really no change in disease patterns. And I think that way of thinking has been totally discredited, although still, if I go to a spa in many countries, the food that I'm served is ultra low fat food. And people think that's the way you make food healthier, is to reduce the fat content. And, that has nothing to do with it. I think carbohydrates and the nature of carbohydrates are much more relevant there. So yes, I have seen big changes in how we're thinking, and I expect that there will be more of them. But our center put together over a number of years, I think for 15 years, we had national nutrition conferences in which we brought together the leading nutrition researchers to present their findings to clinicians. These were extremely well attended conferences. And in putting those together, one of the things I learned is that in the community of nutrition researchers, there's a very high degree of consensus on the big questions. And we know what are good fats and what are bad fats, what are good carbs, what are bad carbs. But somehow that information does not make it through either the education of clinicians or certainly the general public, because people seem to think that it's all confusion out there. And, one day they tell us this thing and then they tell us another, so you may as well just eat whatever you like. And that's not how it is.
Yeah, I think that's the big problem with the diet wars, that many people who don't feel that strongly get really put off. They see someone they respect say, I changed my life on a keto diet. They see someone else they respect say, I went vegan and I felt amazing. And I guess there's a wider problem there, I think, which is, I'm interested as to your thoughts on this, Andrew, but I kind of feel we as a society have put a lot of faith, maybe too much faith in experts and other people. And it's kind of like, well,
Mhm.
we need to become our own experts, right? I say to people, listen to what they're sharing, then try it yourself.
Yes,
Tune in,
exactly. Right.
trust how you feel. Just because your neighbor did this diet and they felt amazing doesn't mean that's the right approach for you. I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, I feel that way. And also, I worry that some of these very restrictive ways of eating have a very unhealthy impact on social interaction, on ability to enjoy food or to enjoy food together with other people. I just see this happening all the time, and people saying you have to eat this way. If you don't eat this way, you're going to nutritional hell. I have no patience for that.
Yeah. So food is clearly one of these things where we can tackle inflammation. You mentioned avoiding sort of air pollutants, toxins like cigarette smoke is also really important to help reduce inflammation. But what are some of the other things that we can do with our lifestyle that can help reduce inflammation?
Well, stress has an effect on inflammatory status, and stress is another significant root of many kinds of health problems. I think I would say that learning and practicing methods of neutralizing the harmful effects of stress is right up there with nutrition and physical activity and adequate rest and sleep as one of the planks of healthy living. I don't think it's possible to live without stress, but I think you can learn to manage it and not let it damage the body or mind.
What are some of your favorite sort of stress reduction practices that you find people get real benefit from?
Well, by far, my favorite are breathing techniques. I think that learning how to regulate the breath is the most time and cost-effective method of reducing anxiety, of promoting calmness. And I've been astonished at how little scientific attention has been paid to breath. And by the way, this is something that comes from Indian culture. If you look around the world at places, whether it's martial arts or natural childbirth or athletic performance, where breathing is stressed, and you try to find where this knowledge came from, all roads lead to ancient India. This is a science that developed thousands of years ago in India and has diffused all over the world. As I say, just astonishing how little scientific research has been done on breath and its ability to change physiology, although that finally is changing.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you have widely popularized the 4-7-8 breath.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what the 4-7-8 breath is? And, when did this start coming into your awareness and when did you start talking about it?
It's a yoga technique. So again, thousands of years old. And I learned it from Dr. Fulford. And I've been practicing it since probably the early 1980s, and I have taught it. I teach it to every patient I come into contact with, to all of my students, sometimes to very large groups of people. It's so time efficient. It's just, the method is simply breathing in quietly through your nose to a count of 4, holding your breath for a count of 7, and blowing air out forcibly through your mouth to a count of 8, and repeating that for 4 breath cycles when you're first learning it, and doing that twice a day religiously. And that's all. And by simply doing that over time, over the space of a month or 2 months, you really change the dynamics of the involuntary nervous system. Decrease sympathetic tone, increase parasympathetic tone. The relaxation response lowers heart rate, lowers blood pressure, improves digestion. Really amazing results, and it takes 30 seconds twice a day.
I mean, I love recommendations like that, very, very effective, but free and accessible to everybody, which I think is something that I always try and keep at the back of my mind when talking about health. What there's this theme coming up, Andrew, which is, you mentioned inflammation before. You were becoming aware in the maybe early 80s that there's this kind of root cause of chronic unresolved inflammation that may be behind, or at least contributing in a large way, to things like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, depression, whatever. It's like, okay, great. You also mentioned that you teach the 4-7-8 breath to pretty much every single one of your patients. So what I really love is this understanding and this idea that there are some basics of health, right? There are some commonalities that if we focus on the creation of health in the body, if we focus on reducing inflammation in the body through hopefully lots of lifestyle practices, we can tackle multiple different diseases, even though we're not targeting them specifically. And it's, as you say, that 4-7-8 breath, it sounds like you use that as prevention, as prophylaxis, but also as treatment when somebody has a problem. And I think this is in many ways changing the way that we look at medicine, because we have been taught in a certainly, I was trained, maybe 30, 35 years after you, but a very sort of quite a reductionist model. We're very good at giving labels to different diseases. We separate off the body into different specialities, and that can have value, but also we forget that we're one interconnecting system. And if you change one part of that system, you also have a knock-on effect on other parts as well.
Yeah, let me give you an example with the 4-7-8 breath. This is by far the most effective anti-anxiety measure that I've come across. It makes the drugs that we use for anxiety look very pathetic by comparison. And I have used that in patients with the most extreme forms of panic disorder successfully, although in some cases it took some time of regular practice for them to get control of it. But the difference between treating an anxiety attack or panic disorder with a drug like a benzodiazepine and with the 4-7-8 breath, it's a very stark contrast. When people are panicked or in anxiety states, the subjective experience usually is of being out of control. If you deal with that by giving a medication, you reinforce the false idea that the locus of control is external. And over time, that method becomes less and less effective and often creates dependence. When a person discovers that they have within them the ability to control an anxiety state by regulation of the breath, it's a revelation. It's totally empowering. And that method becomes more effective with repetition and creates greater independence and greater autonomy. It just couldn't be a greater contrast of those two approaches.
Yeah. Completely agree. It's about connecting the patient to what's going on, the feeling that they have got some control over. Otherwise, I agree. It's not only the fact that the treatment itself has very few, if any, side effects, right? So but it's also, it's also that empowerment. And I guess that kind of leads on to this term mind-body medicine, which I've heard you talk about a lot. And I think it's worth kind of really trying to understand, what do you mean when you say mind-body medicine? Do you see the mind and body as separate? Does society see it as separate? And, what does that umbrella term really mean?
I think the only way you can separate mind and body is verbally. I think they are two poles of the same reality. And I think the reigning paradigm in Western science and medicine simply does not see that. That we have a materialistic paradigm in place that states that all that is real is that which is physical, that which can be touched, measured, I guess in medicine, taken out, and that if you observe a change in a physical system, the cause has to be physical. Non-physical causation of physical events simply is not allowed for in that paradigm. And this is why mind-body interactions have been never accorded their proper due, why research in that area has been stunted, why hypnosis has never been fully accepted as a medical modality, for example, why we can't make sense of wart cures. I mean, there's a whole range of things, but that is changing. And some of the change has come about with validating placebo responses through brain imaging and showing that there are correlations with activity in particular areas of the brain. So this makes it accessible to people, gradually changing. But I would say there's a whole range of therapies under the heading mind-body medicine, from biofeedback, hypnosis, visualization, and so forth. In general, these methods are very cost-effective, time-effective, even fun for both practitioner and patient, and yet they are very underutilized in medicine. And they're underutilized because we just don't take this kind of stuff seriously. In my clinical experience, I have again and again seen that the root causes of illness are in the non-physical compartment. Yeah. Unless that's dealt with, all the physical intervention that you do is not going to solve the problem. It's tricky sometimes to present this to patients because many patients are very sensitive to being accused of making up their illness or imagining it, that it's all in their head. And that's not what is meant by this. It's very difficult to use the term psychosomatic because of that connotation.
I don't think as a profession, we've got a bit of a bad reputation in the past for telling people that their IBS, their irritable bowel syndrome, is sort of kind of in their head, or their fibromyalgia is sort of in their head. And I think so there's a real defensiveness from people, understandably, right. The doctor's telling me it's
IBS
in my head.
is clearly in the bowel as well as in the head, and everything is in both.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? The mind and the body. And I guess now we're getting this field of research, which I'm interested as to what state this was in the 60s and 70s, but the last 5-10 years, we've got the microbiome, the gut-brain axis, lots of research showing this bidirectional communication between body, our gut, and the mind in our brains. And, were you aware of this early on? What did the research say, or did you just intuitively and through your experience know that this was going on?
I took a course in medical hypnosis at Columbia University right after I finished my internship. It was one of the most fascinating courses I ever took, and certainly made me aware of the research that was out there, and it totally resonated with my own interests. So I've paid attention to that for a long time. I have a colleague that I worked with for many years who's on our faculty, who is a teaching member of the American Academy of Clinical Hypnosis. And I've sent him many patients. And I remember early on him saying to me that he thought that every dermatological patient and every GI patient should first go to hypnotherapy before they went to dermatologists or gastroenterologists, because those two systems of the body have the highest ratio of innervation and connection to the mind. And I've absolutely found that to be true. And another experience I had shortly after he said that, the leading gastroenterologist in Tucson asked me to have dinner with him. He's in his 60s, and he was very depressed and said that he hoped that I had something that could help him, because he said 90% of the patients that he saw had conditions for which his training did not equip him to do anything about. I mean, that's remarkable. And I think this is absolutely the way it is. And it's not just for GI disorders and dermatological disorders. It applies to many other things as well. And that doesn't mean you should not work on the physical problem, but you want to also be working on the non-physical aspect of it.
Well, there's two things that come to mind there. That 90% statistic is a very striking one. And what's interesting to me is that I would agree with that, actually. There's so much of what we see, we don't, certainly as medical doctors, we don't have tools that work really well for them. Yet I don't know what it is about, I'm not trying to get too down on my profession at all. I'm very proud to be a medical doctor. I'm pleased I went through, like you, that conventional medical training. But I do feel sometimes that there's a certain arrogance within the profession, or I don't know what happens at medical school, where you go in as a kind of open-minded, curious individual, and you come out, or many of us come out,
Yeah.
quite close-minded, thinking we know it all, and actually anything that we weren't taught has no value. And because,
Uh,
a real striking moment for me, Andrew, was it was one of my days as a general practitioner. I moved from specialism into general practice. I was getting quite frustrated with just looking at kidneys, and I really wanted to see how everything linked together. And around one day, I'd seen, I think, close to 50 patients, and I was a bit frustrated. And before I left the clinic to go home, I went through the whole list, and I asked myself, okay, Rongan, how many patients have you really, really helped today?
mm,
And I honestly thought it was about 20%. I thought, yeah, those 20%,
mm,
I think I've really done something cool. The other 80%, I've referred them somewhere, I've given them something to suppress a symptom, but I didn't really understand what was going on. I knew that they would be back. And I thought, I can't do this for 30, 40 years. Like, there must be more to this than that, right? So why is it that
yes.
some of us look at that with honesty and transparency and go, actually, we're really good at this stuff, we're not so good at that stuff? And why is it that others kind of almost ignore that and just stay within that system of going, no, 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 this is the way to do it? Do have you got any answers there? What goes on there?
Well, I consider myself an open-minded skeptic. I'm willing to look at anything, believe anything, but then I need to see proof. I need to confirm that with my own experience. A lot of people that I run into in medicine and science generally, I would say, are closed-minded skeptics, which is very different. And I think in medicine, especially, there is a tendency to be suspicious of, defensive about any information that comes from unfamiliar sources. So a lot of the ideas that are out there in the world of alternative medicine, anything of that sort is just dismissed as nonsense without even paying attention to it. The dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona, who gave me the green light to start this center years ago, Jim Dolan, he was a cardiologist and had been a psychologist as an undergraduate, which has probably accounted for some of his openness to this. When he retired, he said that the achievement he was most proud of in his career was starting the Integrative Medicine Center. And he said this about all the flack that he got for allowing this to happen. And he told a story about the attitudes of people in our profession. And I think it's interesting. The observation that aspirin was an anticoagulant and may have a preventive effect in coronary artery disease was first made, I think it was in the 1950s, by a general practitioner in Kansas who noticed that when he was taking aspirin, noticed that when he cut himself shaving that he bled more than usual. So he thought maybe aspirin was responsible for this. He started giving aspirin to some of his friends and confirming this effect. And he wrote an article in a journal of general practice saying that aspirin had anticoagulant activities and might be useful as a preventive in coronary artery disease. It took something like 30 years for the medical profession to come around to that point of view. And a major reason why they didn't was that this had been proposed by a general practitioner and published in a journal that cardiologists didn't read. And it was dismissed as an outrageous idea. And that's within the profession. So imagine when something comes from the world of traditional Chinese medicine or the world of herbal medicine, that provokes this kind of the same sort of response.
When you were giving the definition of integrated medicine, I think you used the word conventional medicine within it. And you just mentioned the phrase traditional Chinese medicine. And it's an interesting thought, isn't it? When we talk about conventional medicine or traditional medicine, it's, again, there's a sort of inbuilt arrogance there. It's like, well,
yes, it is. But our system of medicine is not that old. And if you're going to call something traditional, I think it should be at least 1,000 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
So
It's
Native American medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, but not what we're doing today as allopathic medicine. I mean, that only goes back maybe 100 years.
I mean, what is incredible is to see, as you said, with breathing, but there's a lot of science now coming out, isn't there, to support what these ancient healing modalities, traditional Chinese medicine, Indian Ayurvedic medicine, have been talking about for years, whether it's a period of time each day without food, or, a period of time every 24 hours where you're not putting food in, whether it's breathing practices, whether it's the fact that different organs have different genetic activity, and that they're more or less active at different parts of the day. I remember the Guardian newspaper in the UK covered a study maybe 2 or 3 years ago, which was showing, it was about the circadian clock and how the liver is more and less active at certain parts of the day. Other organs are as well. And the kind of conclusion was, so we can then use different medications at different times in the day. And okay, that may be one of the conclusions, but I was also thinking, have traditional Chinese medicine and Indian medicine not been saying this for thousands of years, that there's a different rhythm to different organs at different times of the day? And I guess for you, as someone who's been preaching this message for a good 50 years, you're now seeing a lot more mainstream support in a way that you presumably weren't 40, 50 years ago. I guess for some of these other modalities, not that they need it, I guess, but it must be quite gratifying to see, these guys are kind of catching up to what we already knew.
As I say, there are ideas in these systems that to me seem so powerful and useful. And there's other ideas that don't seem that way. And I look at all this, and I'm very selective in what I take from other systems. One idea that I find very powerful from Chinese medicine. I have another colleague, an MD in New York, who practices what he calls modern Chinese medicine. And I once heard him say that if you could summarize all of Chinese medical philosophy in one sentence, it would be to dispel evil and support the good. In Western medicine, all of our focus is on dispelling evil. We identify what we see as agents of disease or causes disease, and we blast them with weapons, usually pharmaceutical. And we really pay no attention to supporting the good, which are the intrinsic resistance or defensive functions of the human body. And just as a concrete example of this, if you look at the way we manage gastroesophageal reflux disease, we use these very powerful medications that suppress production of stomach acid. We say that's the problem, is too much acid in the stomach, and we stop it with a very powerful drug. That's an example of the dispelling evil philosophy. We do nothing to support the defensive function of the body, which is how do you make the gastric mucosa more resistant to the erosive action of stomach acid. And there are various ways of doing that. There are natural products that do that, adjustment of diet. I see so many patients who are put on these medications without any dietary history being taken, without any warning of the addictive nature of these drugs, the long-term problems that they cause. I mean, that's the unbalanced Western approach that could really benefit from paying attention to that idea from Chinese medical philosophy.
Yeah, and the system, the modern medical system really feeds that, doesn't it? Because, as you said that, I had a flashback to, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, I'm going to guess, in clinic, a lot of patients waiting outside. This is much more conventional NHS general practice. And I can't remember the exact patient, but they'd come in, they'd still got these gut acid type symptoms. They'd already been on, I think they started off on omeprazole, the proton pump inhibitor.
Yep.
Then the doctor had changed it wasn't working, to lansoprazole. And then I think I had a protocol which said, there's a new one called esomeprazole. Let's try that. That's the third line that's recommended by the local hospitals. And you just get into this maddening vortex where, no one's understood the root cause of it. They've been put on one proton pump inhibitor. My understanding is that the early trials on proton pump inhibitors only looked at their use for a few weeks, 3-4 weeks
Exactly,
maximum.
wrong. Exactly.
Whereas now, people are on them for 10 plus years, just on repeat prescriptions.
Right. And this is a problem that I think is really not appreciated, that I've been trying to call people's attention to, both my colleagues and patients, that when you use these powerful counteractive agents long-term, you run into a problem I call the homeostatic trap. that the body will push back against what you're doing. So if you try to block the production of stomach acid with a drug, over time, the body is going to try to produce more acid. So if you lower the dose or stop the medication, there's going to be an outpouring of acid much worse than you had to begin with. And so people think, well, then I can't get off these. I have to take them. And over time, you are worsening or prolonging the problem. And the same thing happens with depression. Yeah. You give SSRI antidepressant drugs to increase serotonin at neural junctions. How is the body going to respond to that? It's going to try to, it'll make less serotonin and it will drop serotonin receptors. So that if after a year of use, you try to get off that or reduce the dose, depression is increased. There's even a name for this now. It's tardive dysphoria, which is lingering depression as a result of treatment. And you see this again and again with so many of our pharmaceutical agents.
And there's a double problem, isn't there, Andrew? There's a problem that the person who initially came to the doctor with these heartburn, acid symptoms that were causing them problems at work or that when they went to sleep, because we didn't address the root cause then, we gave them a pill which may, unless we have been really clear that this is a short-term intervention to help your symptoms while we deal with the underlying root cause, which is where I think those things can potentially have value sometimes for some patients.
Yep. Short-term, yep.
If we explain that, but we disempower the patient, they start taking the pill, think, oh, I've got a problem that I need this pill to fix. Yep. And then when they can't get off it, they think, yeah, it reinforces, I have that problem. I need the pill or I can't function without realizing your body is reacting. And it sounds as though we're talking about rare cases. I bet you if you go to any general practice in the UK,
it's all over the place.
You will have hundreds, if not thousands of patients at every practice who are in this situation. And it's so frustrating because once they're on it, it is challenging to get them.
Very challenging. Very challenging. And by the way, Rangam, when I was growing up in the late 1940s, 1950s, gastric reflux did not exist. People had heartburn and they dealt with it mostly by taking calcium carbonate, mint-flavored calcium carbonate, which is relatively safe. And I think most people understood that heartburn was your stomach's way of telling you that you'd mistreated it. Either you ate too much, you ate the wrong things. But now this has become completely medicalized into this condition, due to too much stomach acid, and you treat it with these powerful medications and then go about your business. And as I say, almost every patient I see who is in this situation where they're dependent on the drug and can't get off, they were started on them without any questions being asked about what they were eating, were they drinking coffee, were they smoking, what their stress levels was, no inquiry into any of that.
Yeah. Or how stressful their lives were. Yep. Were they eating on the move while, it sounds so basic, but there's almost always a way to help people with those symptoms if you take the time to understand what's causing them in the first place. And you're spot on. It's this medicalization of symptoms, whereas, it's the body sign. It's trying to talk to you and raise. It's trying to scream at you. You got to do something differently, right? You're not treating me well. Yep. But instead of listening, I guess it's reflective of just how busy and stressed out people are now, whether it's the doctors in practice, whether it's the patients in their busy lives, that it's almost, it kind of feels like it's the perfect storm. Medicine has got these quick fix solutions for busy people who don't feel they've got the time and energy to make change. And then you end up in this really problematic and quite toxic situation.
Well, this is the perfect opportunity for doctors to be teachers and to be able to explain to patients why long-term use of these counteractive pharmaceutical strategies is not wise, that it's going to get you into worse trouble and may produce bad effects of its own, and what the root causes of these things are and what changes you can make. That's what we should be doing. And it is very rewarding to do that and to see, good results.
Yeah. You mentioned the placebo effect before and the power of the mind. And I've shared on this podcast before that my realization over the past few years has been, yes, food, movement, sleep, stress, super important. They are very, very important things to try and help everyone with. But actually, if you go one step further, I really am feeling more and more that it's the mind, it's our belief systems up here, how we view the world actually determines a lot of those behaviors in the first place. And unless we tackle that, yeah, we can make big improvements with food and movement and stress. But at some point, to really get that long-term change, we've got to tackle what's going on up here. And you mentioned the placebo. And it's interesting that there's such powerful research behind the placebo, but how do we talk about it in medicine? It's the most derogatory thing in the world when you were talking about trials, isn't it? It speaks to how little credence we give or have typically given to the power of
Yes.
our minds.
Yes, the two most common usages of the word placebo I hear in medicine are, how do you know that's not just a placebo effect? And the most interesting word there is just, or we have to rule out the placebo effect. We should be ruling it in. Placebo responses are pure healing responses from within, mediated by the mind. And that's what we should be trying to make happen more often. That is the art of medicine. How do you present treatments to patients to get the maximum healing response with the minimum direct physical intervention? Again, something that I began writing about long ago and talking about, and I'm happy to see gradually a change coming about in that area. But that word is so charged and so loaded, and the thinking that placebo responses are imaginary and they're not as important. There's a little assignment that I like to give to medical students and also to doctors in training as well, is to pick up any medical journal at random that reports randomized controlled testing of drugs, and look up an article and flip to the back where there's a table summarizing the results. In the placebo group, there will always one or two or a small number of subjects who show all of the changes produced in the experimental group. In other words, any change that we can produce in the human body with a pharmaceutical agent can be exactly reproduced in at least some individuals some of the time, purely by a mind-mediated mechanism. To me, that is the most important single fact that's come out of this whole era, 70 years of randomized controlled drug testing. And that's what we should be trying to figure out how to take advantage of and make happen more at the time.
It's something that doctors who I train ask a lot. They say this, and I'm assuming you've heard this a lot as well. Dr. Weil, Dr. Chatterjee, I understand what you're saying, but patients just don't do what I tell them to do. Mm-hmm. And I find that language and that phrasing very telling in and of itself. What I tell them to do, I think, is potentially problematic. And there's this kind of thing that, I know everything, but the patients just don't do what I ask them. And one thing I teach doctors is, when I get asked what's the most important thing I've learned in 20 years of seeing patients, my answer is always connect first, educate second. And I always say
and also to model behavior for patients. As I said this earlier, that you have to embody the changes that you want to see in others. So you have to model health for your patient.
But
living.
I totally agree. And why I'm so passionate about that is I've realized that until the patient across the table from you has really connected with you, made eye contact, like really felt heard, I just don't think they're that willing or that engaged to then take the next step. Whereas if we just rush in to give the solution, it just doesn't work that well. And then if you take that outside medicine, because what is the patient-doctor relationship? Well, it's a relationship, isn't it? So how does it work with your partner or your wife or your children? Who responds well to just being told what to do? It's always about feeling seen, feeling heard, really, really having someone validate who you are and how you're feeling before you take that next step. And it's such an obvious thing. Again, we're not taught it in medical school, but for me, Dr. Weil, that is one of the big truths that I've learned from seeing thousands of patients. And I'm interested as to your view on that. Is that something you've come across before? Would you agree with that, or would you modify that somewhat?
I very much agree with that. By the way, one of the reasons that I like doing the 4-7-8 breath with patients is that it establishes a very intimate connection with the patient to breathe with them. They're not expecting that, they're not used to that, and I find that facilitates further connection. Also, a practical technique that we teach to the people that we train is motivational interviewing. And this is a technique developed recently. It's a dialogue that you have with a patient that helps you and the patient identify mental patterns that are obstacles to making changes in behavior and lifestyle, and then helping them develop alternative mental patterns that facilitate the changes you want. It's a very useful technique, and it's something practical that can be taught.
I mean, speaking of Hippocrates that you mentioned before, a phrase that popped into my mind was, I think this is Hippocrates, it's more useful to know what sort of person has a disease than what type of disease a person has. And I think that is, again, something I figured out over many years of getting frustrated and not being able to help my patients as much as I wanted to. I sort of came to that truth that way. And that, I guess, speaks to the power of the mind and how we're all sort of individual. You mentioned the power of the mind. Sorry, yeah, go, please.
No, you made me think. I just had a flash on being in medical school and being told by an attending physician, go see the gallbladder in room 7.
Yeah. That says it all, doesn't it? Says it all.
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking that you've shared a story in the past where I think you had taken some form of psychedelic mushroom potentially, and whilst you were under its influence, you were able to do a yoga pose that you had that previously you weren't unable to do? I wonder if you could just share that story, because I think that really speaks beautifully to how our mind can get in the way.
It's an example of what the potential of these agents is. It was actually LSD, and I was, I think, 28, living in a rural area in Virginia. It was a beautiful spring day, and I took LSD with a group of friends outside. And I had been just starting to practice Hatha yoga. I had been doing it for, I don't know, a month or so. And one posture that I had a really hard time with is the plow, where you lie on your back on the floor and you raise your legs and then try to touch your toes behind your head. I got my toes within a foot of the floor, and I had horrible pain in my neck, and I just got stuck there. I couldn't do it no matter how much I practiced, and I was on the verge of giving up. I thought I was too old. My body was too stiff. And then on this day when I was under the influence of LSD, I felt terrific. My body felt really elastic. I was, wonderful. I thought, gee, I ought to try that. So I lay down and I was lowering my feet. I thought I had about a foot to go, and they touched the ground. I couldn't believe it. And I did it repeatedly. I was just so joyful to be able to do that. The next day I tried to do it, and I got my feet within a foot of the floor, and I had excruciating pain in my neck. But there was a difference. I now knew that it was possible. And up to that point, I didn't think so. And so I kept at it. And in another couple of weeks, I was able to do it. If I had not had that experience, I think I would have given up. So, I saw a possibility that I did not believe in, and that motivated me. And I think there's tremendous potential for psychedelics in medicine, not just in psychiatric medicine, of showing people that it's possible to experience their bodies in a different way. I think that's very applicable to chronic pain, for example, allergies, autoimmunity. But there's other ways of getting glimpses of that as well. One of them is simply meeting a person who's had your illness and is now better. And if I can arrange for patients to meet other people who are well, who've had their same illness, that's a very powerful way of overriding any negative predictions they've had.
You mentioned psychedelics, and sort of my feeling is that in America, at least the things and the interviews and the conversations I consume from America, a lot of quite prominent people seem to be talking about the potential value of certain psychedelics for certain conditions. And I think Johns Hopkins, I think lots of prestigious institutions, research institutions are now studying this. So I wonder, you're someone who was, I think, studying marijuana and its effects on health in the 1960s, a long time ago, maybe one of the first people to do this.
Yeah.
I wonder if you, for any listeners who are naive to this, who've never heard about this, you're a super well-respected doctor, you train at Harvard Medical School. Could you just outline, what are psychedelics? How can they provide utility for people, and why have they been demonized for so long?
Well, psychedelics there are two groups of them chemically. There are natural sources of them, and there are chemical sources of them. These are substances that I think have extremely low potential for toxicity, probably lower than any other drugs that we know of. They can produce very dramatic psychological effects that are quite dependent on set and setting, on people's expectations, and on the environment in which they're taken. So the most common ones are LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, which comes from the peyote cactus. Psilocybin is from mushrooms. There is a drug called MDMA, which is slightly different category. Marijuana, cannabis is not a psychedelic, it's something else. But there was a lot of research interest in these in the 1950s, and some really wonderful research on them. And then it all got shut down when, in the wake of the hippies and Timothy Leary, and very restrictive laws were passed against them. And only now, recently, has this come about again. And it's not just in the U.S., although I think we're farther along. Canada is well along in making psilocybin available for the treatment of depression. And there's actually a lot of activity in the UK with psychedelics as well, and in some of continental Europe. I think this is happening all over, and that we're going to see very quickly that, I think we'll see psilocybin made available for the treatment of drug-resistant depression and anxiety, MDMA for PTSD, which is a huge problem in America among returning war veterans. So I think we're going to see these compounds made available for therapeutic use, but at the same time, there's tremendous interest in the general public in them. In the pre-COVID, when I was traveling a lot and speaking, whatever the subject I was talking about, whether it was healthy aging, integrative medicine, nutrition, the questions I got were about psychedelics. How can we take them? How can we find guides, experiences? Just tremendous mainstream interest. I think 2 months ago, Vogue magazine in the US had a cover story on psilocybin. That's kind of mainstream interest that's really remarkable.
Wow. So you mentioned before, when we were talking about anti-inflammatory diets, you mentioned green tea. And I know you are a particular fan of green tea. In particular, from what I understand, it's matcha. Can you tell me about, when you became aware of matcha, what happened there, and why you're so passionate about people drinking more of it?
When I was growing up, tea was something drunk by old people and sick people. And I drank iced tea, heavily sweetened. When I was 17, I had a chance to live in Japan with Japanese families. And I really came to love green tea. Very good. And I'd seen nothing like that in America. And I was also introduced at that time to matcha in the Japanese tea ceremony. Matcha is the powdered green tea that's whisked into a froth and consumed in the tea ceremony. And I began bringing that back when I would go to Japan and turn people onto it. Nobody had ever heard of it in the States. And then sometime in the 1980s, I think this was again way ahead of its time, I formed a connection with a Japanese company that produced matcha and tried to sell it through my website, drweil.com, but it was not the right time for it. And then it's been quite amazing to me to watch how fashionable matcha has become in recent years. But I was concerned that most of the stuff that people were drinking was not good quality, because matcha is so finely powdered that it oxidizes very quickly and it loses its bright green color and good flavor. And so I wanted to make really good quality matcha available. And I again formed a relationship with another Japanese company near Kyoto, and formed a company called matcha.com, Matchakari, that's selling this. And turning a lot of people on to this. I think it's a wonderful product. First of all, there's a great deal of research on the health benefits of tea in general, on green tea in particular, a lot due to its antioxidant content. Matcha is different in that the leaves are grown in a way that increases the content of antioxidants. And it also has a high content of an amino acid called L-theanine that has a calming effect. And I think that modifies the effect of caffeine and makes the stimulation of tea, and matcha in particular, very different from that of coffee. It does not have the jangling effect of coffee. It does not leave you with a crash when the stimulation wears off. People say it causes a state of calm alertness that I think is very desirable. So I think it's a good thing. Matcha is also beautiful and delicious, and I'm going to have a bowl of it after we finish talking.
There's a ritual, isn't there, in Japan as to how this is prepared, though, and I sort of feel like this the matcha tea that you sell. What are people buying? They're buying the powder that they then have to...
They buy the powder, and I don't care what they do with it. I mean, if they want to use an electric whisk, if they want to make a latte out of it, if they want to sweeten it, however they want to do it. I like doing it in the traditional way, which is using a bamboo whisk in a small amount of hot water, unsweetened. But, in Japan now, matcha has escaped the tea ceremony ritual. That's really a kind of old-fashioned thing, and matcha is now consumed mostly by people, not as part of a ritual. Although I think there's a long association of tea in general, and matcha in particular, with meditation, and again, very different association from that of coffee. I think matcha has been associated with contemplation, with meditation, and the ritual of preparing it. When I whisk it in a bowl, I find that to be very meditative and relaxing.
I think what you're speaking to there is something that, again, I think is a missing piece in modern life and even in modern day health promotion, which is, it's not only what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. So, if you're taking 5 or 10 minutes to prepare your green tea, it's not just a habit, it's a ritual. It's a time to dedicate to yourself, to actually be present with a certain process. And I'm interested as your view on this, but I've been thinking recently that we do science. We look at green tea, or we look at the polyphenols in coffee, and we go, oh, this is a great thing. And so we, in our rush lives, we make a quick coffee, we slug it down, and we go, and then we say, oh yeah, it's got loads of polyphenols and it's really good for me. And I kind of feel, have we lost something somewhere? Because for me, for example, I do drink coffee. I've limited it to, I know what works for me, but I have it first thing in the morning. Now I know people will say, because I'm an early riser, I'm usually up by 5. People will say it's probably not with your circadian biology the perfect time to have it. However, I would argue that, that hour and a half in the morning before my wife and kids get up is my sacred time for myself. Yeah. And I make it in a very ritualistic way. I don't slug it down while doing something else. I'm paying attention to it. And I feel actually, for me, on balance, when you take into account everything, that forms a very important part of my day. And, I feel more and more we're missing this piece when we talk about health.
I hear you. I agree with you. And I would extend that to eating in general. And one of the things that has struck me, especially when I spent time in Italy and in France, is how different the attitude is of people toward eating. That in the US, you're rushed out of restaurants. It's in a hurry. There's a lot of concern about is this healthy? Is this not healthy? I think in continental Europe, especially in France and Italy, there's so much more attention and time given to the enjoyment of food, to lingering over it, to sharing, eating in company as a social ritual. And I think that has, as much to do with lowered rates of obesity, for example, as what people are eating.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a study, a UK study, I think it was the University of Birmingham, a few years ago, showed that actually if you eat in a rush while distracted, so doing something else, watching television, you eat more at that meal and at subsequent meals for the rest of the day, right? Which again really speaks to what you're saying. There are, it's not just what you're eating, it's how you're eating, it's the intention, it's what's going on in the mind as you're eating. Yeah, super interesting. So I feel you've definitely sparked my interest to have some matcha tea this weekend. What's the URL? I think it's
just matcha.com. Matcha.com.
Fantastic. Yeah. What about your daily routine? I mean, you're someone who has been sort of, really a pioneer in this field, and I think a lot of us would be interested to know, how do you? I mean, how old are you now? I think is it?
I am 79.
I mean, 79, incredible, and looking in tip-top health. What do you do on a daily basis? Because I think it would be quite, if you're happy.
I get up early. I beat you wrong on. I got up at 4:20 this morning. I tend to get up when the sky starts to get light, and that's my best time. I do some sitting meditation in the morning. I have 2 dogs. I come down and feed them. I might have my bowl of matcha and something light to eat, and then I take the dogs on a walk. I have a garden that I grow a lot of my own food. I try to get walks in or swim every day. That's my favorite form of exercise. I'm mentally active most in the morning. If I'm going to write or do intellectual work, I like to do that in the morning. And afternoons are more for relaxing, reading, spending time with friends, preparing food, cooking. That's my usual day. And I'm usually in bed by usually 9, at the latest 10.
Yeah. Love it. So much to think about there. Just to sort of close off this conversation, Dr. Weil, I'm interested. You've seen a lot of changes in healthcare over the past 50 years. You've seen things come in, things go. You've seen things take the public interest and leave the public interest. If you look at the US healthcare system, because I know that's where you're based, I know you've traveled the world, so you're probably quite familiar, I think, with other healthcare systems. Yeah. It's very easy for, I think, many of us to criticize our own healthcare systems, other healthcare systems. But if you were to look at the US healthcare system, yes, there are some negatives which you've spoken about before, you've spoken about on this show. You can perhaps recap on what some of those negatives are. But are there any positives that we can take, that around the world we can learn and go, oh, God, America are doing that really, really well when it comes to health? I'm really interested as to your view on that, and how other countries need to evolve their healthcare systems as well.
Well, we don't have a healthcare system in the US. We have a disease management system, and it's functioning very imperfectly and getting worse by the minute. And also, we, as the richest nation, are unable to guarantee basic healthcare services to all of our citizens. That's unconscionable. So those are the big black marks. I think as a result of the economic collapse of our healthcare system, we're spending an outrageous amount of our gross domestic product on healthcare and have terrible health outcomes. That's unsustainable. But as a result of that, that is what's fueling the integrative medicine movement, which is much more developed in the US than it is anywhere else. If our healthcare system were not in such trouble, our institutions would not be open to this. A lot of the people that come to, the fellows who come to us to study, are sponsored by their institutions, by their hospital systems, who are paying for their tuition. This would not be happening if the economics of healthcare in this country were in such a mess. And I see this happening around the world. We were not getting any people from the UK until very recently, for example, or from Western Europe. But as the economics of healthcare begin to deteriorate everywhere, there is openness to integrative medicine. And I think that's the great change.
Do people from around the world have to come to America to do that residency, or can they do it online?
It's online. We have had, until COVID, we had 3 residential weeks in Tucson that were scattered through the 2-year fellowship. But in the past 2 years, we've done it all online, and we may now go back to some residential teaching.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get a link from you. We'll put it in the show notes for people and doctors who are interested in that. You mentioned universal healthcare. Of course, that's something we do have in the UK. We have the National Health Service, which is something this country is very, very proud of. But something I've been thinking about over the summer is, I'm on a social media hiatus at the moment for 4 weeks, and it's really the time of the year where I really feel I really get to tune into my own thoughts again and what I think, rather than being influenced by what I'm reading online each day. And I've been thinking about the NHS, and of course, incredible benefits of having something like the National Health Service. My own father, who had lupus when he was 59, kidneys failed, dialysis for 15 years, no problem, all paid for. If he was in India or in another country around the world and he couldn't afford dialysis, I wouldn't have had those 15 years with Dad that I had. So there's huge benefits. But in an era, in the 21st century, in an era where the majority of our health problems are driven by our collective modern lifestyles, I'm really interested is there any downside of having this kind of universal healthcare system whereby we're not really incentivized personally to look after ourselves? Because actually, if you look after yourself, you never even need to access the doctor. So you're not even getting what you put in. I'm just it's a thought experiment for me at the moment to figure out, is there any downside here? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, but first of all, I don't think it's sustainable, because in the UK, as everywhere now, you have an aging population. You have epidemics of lifestyle-related diseases. You have increasing costs of the high-tech interventions, which is what conventional medicine depends on. And all of those trends are making healthcare increasingly unaffordable. So the system cannot go on that way. And the issue that you raised, that this really does not provide incentives for prevention and for people taking responsibility for how they live and managing their disease risks, it's all feeding into this. So I can't see that this can go on.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Dr. Weil, it's been a real honor to speak to you today. I could have spoken to you for many more hours, and I hope we get the chance to meet at some point in the future when the world opens up. Just to finish off then, this podcast is called Feel Better, Live More. When we feel better in ourselves, we get more out of our life. You've shared a lot of things today on the show, and I wonder if we could just finish off with you sharing some of your most practical, most impactful tips that you've seen over 50 years make the most difference in people's lives.
I think really trust in and pay attention to your body's healing ability, because it is your greatest asset. Learn the basic facts about nutrition, avoid processed manufactured food, and really pay attention to breathing and learn how to breathe. I mean, that's absolutely basic.
Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for all your work over the years, and I hope we get to meet at some point in the future.
Good. I enjoyed it, Ron.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Gut bugs, the microbiota at the interface of your digestion and the rest of your body, are one of the key educators of the immune system. And again, this is something that's probably exploded in the field of immunology in the last 10, 15 years. If you take an experimental animal model where the animals have a reduced or a minimal collection of good bacteria in their gut, their immune system doesn't develop. And they're very impaired in how they can respond and heal. And even things like protection from cancer, because our immune system is the main cancer surveillance system. So these bugs are helping to educate and teach and mature our immune system. And this happens potentially in utero before we're born, but predominantly when we enter the world, because we go from a relatively sterile, there is some evidence that there may be some bugs in the placenta, but we go into this hugely germy world. And suddenly our immune system has to cope with that, because, it's got all these receptors on it to detect pathogens as being problematic. So it has to learn to tolerate those, because, most of the bugs around us are safe and harmless, and we need them because they're helping us.
And that's actually how the immune system develops, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It is by exposure to the environment around it, to the bugs around it, to sort of give it that sort of ongoing education. So it starts to learn, I respond to this. I don't need to respond to that.
Exactly. I often say that, the immune system's made, it's not born. There's maybe a percentage in the genetics that we inherit, but then it's made, it's built throughout our life, and it changes throughout our life. So
that's a lovely idea. It's made, not born. We can build and we can sort of develop it the way we want to, if we give it the right
inputs. Yeah. And I often think about the inputs as a way to shape the immune system. And I was working on a talk the other day, and I was trying to make a slide of all the inputs, some that we can control, some that we can't, that are shaping our immune system from birth. And then this became a really busy, messy slide because there was too much to put on there. But a lot of it happens in childhood. And in some ways I find that quite daunting as a mother. And you think, well, there's sort of first 3 years, I would say, is when you're being colonized by all these good bacteria. And there's huge changes going on in the immune system during that time. And there's this kind of interaction happening. These bacteria, they help protect the gut barrier to keep it very nice and tight, and stop any bacteria going into the body, because they're only good bacteria if they're in the right location. So they're not meant to cross over the gut and enter our body, because then they become a problem. But one of the biggest things that they're doing to help our immune system is they're eating our foods. And I often think your diet's only as good as your microbiota in your gut, because they're the interface. They're eating your food. They're helping you to produce these vitamins and minerals from your diet, but they're also producing these postbiotics. And people might have heard of prebiotics and probiotics, but postbiotics are basically the metabolic waste of the bugs in your gut. So they're producing stuff that is their kind of, waste product of eating your foods.
Like short-chain fatty acids.
Short-chain fatty acids is the classic one. I used to work on these when I lived in Switzerland, and looking at how they influence inflammation in the gut and beyond. So short-chain fatty acids are kind of a metabolic byproduct of the bugs in your gut, and they directly bind to the immune cells at that site, and they help educate them and teach them to sort of tolerate anything that you're throwing down your mouth, because we're not supposed to react to that, because it should be, benign things that are going in there. But they have to help strike that balance that if you did get some kind of food poisoning, they also can identify the bad bugs.
Yeah.
So they help create an environment that's what we call tolerogenic. So it's encouraging tolerance of the food that you're eating. And there's a very kind of dynamic interaction between these bugs and the immune cells. And I'd say what happens in the gut is not just staying there. This influence, this sort of tolerogenic influence of things like short-chain fatty acids is also being absorbed into your bloodstream and helping regulate the immune system at distal sites from the gut as well.
It helps make T regulatory cells,
yes,
doesn't it?
Exactly.
Which, as you said before, I mean, you mentioned the term peacekeeper. I think the first time I read that, I think it was in a Nature paper in 2014, I think. Mm-hmm. I think I used that in one of my slide decks. It's where it calls them our peacekeepers.
Yeah.
I think for the first time when I saw it in print, which is kind of what they are, really. And I sort of, I mean, I really think a lot of people talk about gut health these days, but I don't think people understand the immune system's linked to it. They think the
Yes,
gut is
yeah.
something separate, but I often teach doctors about this triad between our diet, our gut bugs, and our immune system, and how they all sort of cross-talk.
Oh, definitely.
There's bi-directional communication between, diet and gut bugs, diet and immune system, and gut bugs and immune system together.
Yes.
It's like this. So, if you make certain dietary choices, you're going to improve the health of your gut bugs, which is going to improve the health of your immune system.
Yes, exactly.
Which is empowering, right? Because we can do something about that.
Yes. Exactly. And I think as a nation, we're not eating enough fiber. And also fiber in the UK has a really bad image problem, I think. Most people, I think...
Come on, let's give it some PR.
If I was to ask my husband what he thinks fiber is, and he's not in any kind of medical nutrition wellness field, in fact, the other day he came home with some crackers that he's like, look, they say they've got added fiber. And I was like, okay, because we kind of think of it as being
cardboard.
Those breakfast cereals like cardboard with the big fiber logo on it, and or fiber as being one thing. But again, it's the diversity. Different bugs need different forms of fiber, and we find it in all the plant-based foods. So it's not just the fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, beans, pulses, and whole grains. And it's about trying to bring in the diversity. I think in the last few years, there's a publication about the sort of trying to get 30 different plant-based foods into your diet, because it's about per week. Yeah, because it's about the diversity.
But that includes, I think, lentils and nuts.
Yeah.
I think it's very achievable once people have it in their mind.
Exactly,
to do it.
And they're very common in traditional diets. I remember growing up, my mum would add lots of different grains and beans and pulses to spin things out, as she put it, so that you could make a dish go a lot further.
Yeah, wonderful advice. So far we've said that lots of different colors, lots of different diversity of plants is going to help your gut microbiome. It's going to help your immune system. Eating less is also something that might be helpful, right?
Yeah. So this is another field I've just got fascinated with. And that's the Immunometabolism. I don't know if you've heard anything about this.
I love that word. Yeah. Love it. Immunometabolism.
Shipping two words together.
Yeah, I like it.
And it's only just in the last 5 years that it's really kind of popped up, and people have started looking at this. But metabolism is basically breaking down of the major components of our diet, so the protein, carbohydrate, and fats, into energy and building blocks that our cells can use. And people might hear things about metabolic rate, or I've got a good metabolism, these kind of things that people say. And metabolism and the immune system are really intimately entwined. And I don't know why it's taken us so long to figure that out, because immune responses are energetically very costly. There has to be sort of triaging of resources to be like, right, we're going to fight this infection and turn on all the inflammation, turn on all the antibody producing and all those molecules that are being produced, and the proliferation of immune cells. That takes a lot of resources. So it needs energy, it needs building blocks.
Is this why we feel tired when we're fighting an infection? Because the body's diverting resource to making all that stuff that's going to fight it.
And you might find that you need to kind of build yourself back up again after you've been sick, particularly if you've been sick for quite a long time, or if you have an ongoing illness. Your nutritional needs might be very different from somebody who doesn't have that. So immunometabolism is the field that's trying to understand how metabolism can shape immune responses and vice versa. So this happens at the level of the individual immune cell, but also can happen in the environment of a tissue and in the environment of our whole body. And this is something that there's not really any kind of absolute concrete understanding yet in this area. But we know that when an immune cell is fighting an infection, it goes through a metabolic switch. And it goes from being in this kind of resting state to suddenly sucking up lots more glucose to fuel proliferation. The immune cells are making armies of themselves. Building antibodies requires, the building blocks of proteins, all of this kind of thing. is happening. And that metabolic switch is known as the Warburg effect. This is also what's happening to cancer cells. But immune cells do this and it's perfectly normal when they're fighting an infection or fighting any kind of problem. And then it's switched back off and the immune cells go back to normal and they don't have this huge need for metabolites anymore. But what people are starting to wonder is, can the overall environment of a body influence the metabolic switches inside our immune cells and switch them on aberrantly when they're not needed? So we know that diabetics with poorly controlled blood sugar, so they have elevated blood sugar in their body, this creates an environment that causes some of our immune cells, like neutrophils, to not work so well. So immune cells have nutrient sensing switches inside them, so they can sense what nutrients are available, and they're taking in that information, and then that affects how they can work. Now, what is not known is, can we feed someone different macronutrients, proteins, carbs, or fats, and influence how their immune system is working? So can you switch unwanted immune responses off or on based on the different macronutrients that your body's metabolizing? And I think this is where the field of immunology is going to be headed in terms of treating chronic diseases, because we know that people with chronic diseases like metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, or people who are carrying too much visceral fat, that the whole environment of their bodies is metabolically different. And this might be causing the immune cells to act abnormally and become more pro-inflammatory, for example.
Wow. Super interesting.
Yeah.
So a lot of research to come in that area.
Exactly. And I think we just don't know enough to say specifics yet. But I think that's, for so long we've been focused on the micronutrients, but actually it's the macronutrients. So you could adjust someone's diet, give them different proportions of protein, fat, and carb to maybe alter their metabolism and alter immune cells that were going wrong. So somebody who had a chronic inflammatory disease, we could kind of steer that around.
It's incredibly exciting, isn't it?
On the other side of it, what you said about eating less, another thing that I bring up in the book, because I wanted to get people away from just thinking about, a vitamin supplement for their immune system, is that the immune function is impacted by overnutrition and undernutrition. So if you're not eating enough, or you're eating too much, this is going to send your immune system awry. And I should context that by saying, if you're doing that consistently. And then we have this field of research coming out about fasting and immune function. And I remember being at conferences decades ago, and they were talking about fasting and how it would regenerate all sorts of parts of the body. It was kind of mind-blowing. And now we kind of see it more in the mainstream, and we have all these kind of forms of different diets. And this, again, is causing metabolic switches in the body that then when you go on to refeed after someone has had a period without food, you get increase in growth hormone, you get production of fresh new immune cells from the bone marrow. And the stress of the lack of eating kind of causes some of the older immune cells and ones that might be more likely to malfunction to be deleted. So you're kind of replenishing your immune system. And we start to see in experimental models of autoimmune disease that this is, highly therapeutic.
Yeah, it's fascinating that it's not necessarily just what we're eating.
Mm-hmm.
It's, how much or how little. It's, are we fasting? Are we not fasting?
Mm-hmm.
All these kind of different components that all play, I guess they all play a role in the signals the body is receiving, because I guess that's all it is, isn't it? The immune system is trying to interpret the signals and sort of going, okay, what does that mean? Is it sort of safe, or is it unsafe? Do I need to take action?
Yes.
Or can I just stay calm?
Exactly.
And I guess everything we do, even our thoughts, our words, our sleep, our stress, they're all giving a signal in some way to our immune system.
Exactly.
Is, do I need to respond, or is it okay?
Exactly. Yeah.
At its core, it's that simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
At its core.
Yes. Yeah. It's this decision making that's ongoing and constant, and it's integrating all these different inputs to decide. And I think the thing with the sort of so-called Western diets that we talk about as having a negative impact on our health. It's just really tasty, and we just want to eat it all the time. It's salty, it's sweet, it's delicious, it's everywhere. We can quickly override any lack of hunger cues just to eat. We kind of pathologize being hungry. It's like you're not ever allowed to be hungry. You have to have 10 snacks in your bag in case you might not be able to reach some food. And then we have millions of incidences of eating across a huge portion of our waking time. And part of the research I was involved in several years ago was looking at postprandial inflammation. So when we eat, there's an inflammation, a subtle inflammation that happens in the body. And this is quite normal. We have plenty of checks and balances in place to keep that in check. And actually dietary fiber is one of the best ways to kind of seal that up again and prevent that from happening, as is having a period of time without food in between meals. So eating enough and the right things at one meal that you do not need to eat then till the next meal is actually quite good for overall gut health, but the whole body health.
I'm sort of super fascinated by this research as well. And, not only do many of us eat too much, we eat too often in the day. And as you just said there, that the act of eating is inflammatory. Yeah. So that's a response to eating, is that your body will become inflamed. As you say, nothing to worry about. It's sort of, that's part of the process. But I guess, I know Sachin Panda's done a lot of look at this, Professor Panda. And I think when he started his app in 2015, I think it's called My Circadian Clock, I can't remember the figures offhand, but it's something like 20, 30 years ago, most people were eating 3 times a day in the US. I think we can probably infer in the UK as well. And then in 2015, when he was measuring and people were inputting into the app, I think the top 10% of people were eating 15 times a day. And it was so that, if we think about that, let's say I'm eating 15 times a day, and let's say in theory it is all whole food, right? It's all nice, health, what is considered, you've got to be careful with the language, but what is considered sort of helpful foods for our health? You do have to ask the question, is eating them 15 times a day helpful? That's like 15 bouts of inflammation. Whereas if you had the same sort of food over, it's not a perfect analogy, but 3 times a day over 5 days, you're still getting 15 bouts of inflammation, but that's over the whole week, as opposed to in just one day. And I really do think societally, culturally, there's a problem with how much we're being encouraged to eat, even healthy foods. Like you can buy healthy snacks here and healthy snacks there, but you're sort of inflaming yourself each time. And I don't know, what would you make of that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a real issue. I think it's not well enough understood in the scientific community to really translate into a kind of clear health message for people. But from the research I was involved in and from work like what Sachin Panda has done and others, I definitely think we need to look at the incidence of eating as well as the stretch of time that we're eating. I think some of the studies show that we're spending 18 hours a day eating. Yeah. It's just like the whole time we're awake. And I don't think that we are sort of designed to cope with that on a long-term consistent basis. Going back to the traditional diets, my grandparents weren't eating all day, every day, because that just wasn't how it was constructed. And different cultures will eat in different ways, but it's not common to eat all the time. And I want to fuse the tradition with the modern life somehow, because I think that's the key that we need. We can't go back to times gone by, but we can bring bits that we've left behind and kind of integrate it into what we have to work with right now somehow.
Yeah. I mean, I find a very effective and powerful recommendation I use in my patients is to try not to eat for 12 hours in every 24 hours. So, basically eating all your food within a 12-hour window, which, really was the norm for pretty much everyone maybe 30, 40 years ago. I mean, we might stop eating at 8 p.m. and maybe we wouldn't have breakfast till 8. I mean, I'm not talking about an extreme fast. I'm just saying, I think it's quite, I certainly know when I manage to stick to that consistently, I sleep better, I feel more energetic.
Yeah.
And I think there really is this idea that, you know, you need time for the body to regenerate a little bit. If your gut is constantly having to use up energy to constantly digest food, that's going to impact your immune system. It's going to impact, you know, the resource it has for something else, right?
Yes, exactly. There's, you know, the gut lining as well. There's a kind of, it's energetically costly because there's a turnover of those cells quite regularly. And things like the short chain fatty acids we mentioned earlier that are produced when our gut bugs digest fiber, they are really nurturing to the growth of and repair of the cells that line the gut barrier. And those are kind of the interface cells between what's going on in the gut and what's being put in the bloodstream that could exacerbate that inflammation. And we know that certain things like saturated fat, high fructose diets, fiber poor diets, as well as other things like stress and extreme exercise can alter the integrity of that gut barrier and exacerbate this sort of inflammation that you see postprandially. There's a really interesting study that looked at sort of these 5 major personality types. So they are kind of roughly divided into like openness to experience, conscientiousness, extrovertedness, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So in psychology terms, they're kind of ways that we can be categorized based on our personality. And each of these personality types have specific immunological features. And one of the most interesting things is that some of them are more likely to be pro-inflammatory and have higher levels of C-reactive protein, which is a marker in the blood for inflammation. And things like being neurotic and being sort of less introverted, it can affect the inflammation in our body. Is because I guess we're all very different. We're all on a sort of spectrum of different personalities, but that's evolved from maybe different roles you might play within a community. And then what your exposure to different infections might be, or your risk of getting injured. Things like anger is known to prime the body for becoming damaged, because maybe anger preceded violence. And throughout our evolution, we've like, okay, if you're angry, something might happen that might damage you. So we need to prime parts of our immune system to prepare for that.
You mentioned anger, and it's something I wrote about. I Feel Better in 5 is the importance of forgiveness. There is good research on forgiveness. A guy called Fred Luskin's done the Stanford University, I think, forgiveness trial or research. I can't remember the exact name.
Yeah.
His research is incredible. And I shared in my last book a story about one of my patients who had high blood pressure, and which again, you know, to make it relevant to our conversation, you know, high blood pressure is a chronic, non-communicable illness that, you know, will have chronic inflammation playing a role in some way. And you know what? She had changed her lifestyle. And I was doing this stuff. I try and talk about food and movement and sleep. And you know what? It wasn't budging. And it was to do with, you know, basically her husband of many years had cheated on her, and they had split up. And it was only once she started practicing forgiveness, right, that her blood pressure started going down. It was incredible. And so that's an anecdotal story from my clinic, but I think it does stand firm and consistent with the research that is out there in terms of, if you're holding on to resentment and anger, that will influence your biology and your immune system.
Exactly. And maybe that is culturally what we see dividing different groups and how they deal with illness as well, because they may feel marginalized. I think social status is also really important. I know that in the animal kingdom, being lower down the pecking order can be quite stressful for an animal, and that can be seen in its blood chemistry, but also for us humans. And I think that's you know, something that we see playing out with the sort of lower socioeconomic demographics are worse hit by some of these lifestyle related diseases. They may have more stressful lifestyles. But
we put it down, don't we, to less access to good food, more stress, and of course I think those play a role. But what if it's also related to status, as it is in the animal kingdom? What you know, that's something I hadn't probably given as much thought to, and it's probably not as common a narrative. It's where do you? I guess it's, you know, in many ways, it's, do you feel your life has purpose?
Yes. Yeah.
You know, how do you see your life? What's the meaning behind it? Because that as well in itself has a huge amount of research suggesting it's you know, if you feel your life has meaning and value, you tend to have a happier and healthier life.
Yeah. I mean, another piece of research that came across recently was comparing Samoan individuals to European individuals with Epstein-Barr virus, which is a virus that almost all of us harbor. But when we activate our stress chemistry, this can be actually a sign that the virus uses to allow itself to reactivate and cause problems. And we know in the Western culture that being of a lower socioeconomic status means that you're more likely to experience viral reactivation. But in the Samoan culture, being in a lower socioeconomic status has a totally different impact on the stress chemistry that actually meant it was the people in the higher socioeconomic bracket that were worse affected by latent viral reactivation. And this is just they used the viral reactivation as a sort of readout, an empirical way of measuring the immune system changes. But in different cultures, and we never think about this in medicine.
I mean, what's that like for you as a scientist and as a lecturer? These are the kind of, these would be perceived as a kind of softer aspects of health and science, but it's that data is data, right?
Exactly. We need to bring it together. A lot of the data is actually quite old now, but I guess it's just been parked there. And we have this real kind of biomedical model where we focus in on one cell type and what is that cell doing? And it's really reductionist. And then we try and piece the jigsaw together. And we kind of need to fuse it with the anthropology and be like, okay, now how do we bring these two fields together? Because that's the only way we can tackle, I think, where we're at with our health.
And you sort of, you really beautifully bridge it throughout the book, all these different components, emotions, food, movement, sleep, stress. There's got a nice section on supplements as well, which you probably won't be able to get into today. But
the joy of the table. So the gioia della tavola, which is an Italian phrase for enjoying being at the table, and linking what we were talking about earlier with food to emotions, make your table a joyous place to be, because the endorphins from enjoying being at your table with your family, your friends, or even on your own and just enjoying the meal, endorphins can alter the function of our immune cells because they have receptors for those on them. So those feel-good hormones, that actually helps nurture things like the Tregs, the regulatory T cells. So bringing the food together with the emotion and enjoying that's so important. I mean, we haven't had a kitchen for the last 4 months, so we've had no table, no joy, but we've still been trying to cobble together as a family, little meals on the floor. And
you know what? I'm so delighted to hear you speak about these things, because I think these are things we've missed in health advice.
Yeah.
It has been too reductionist. Eating at a table with, your community, your tribe, has kind of always been a part of human culture.
Yeah.
And I think if you sort of extend the argument that you're making, it's kind of like, well, you could potentially eat the same food, feeling stressed out and lonely.
Yeah.
And the same food might have a different response if you're eating it with good friends when you're feeling relaxed and calm.
Exactly.
I'm convinced of it. One thing I've observed clinically, maybe for 2-3 years now, a lot of people these days are reacting or perceive themselves as reacting to foods.
Yes.
And I think what's really interesting for me is, and I think I really got this in the year preceding me writing The Stress Solution, was I thought, well, if stress changes your gut and your GI tract and your digestion significantly, as it does, well, are they actually reacting to the food, or are they reacting to the fact that they're eating in a stressed state? And I've seen with some patients the same food, if they do some sort of what I call a transition between, action state and eating, when they do that for 1 or 2 minutes before eating, they're no longer reacting to the same foods.
Yeah.
Which,
I think this has even been shown with gluten as the nocebo effect, which people say this all the time. I go on holiday, I can eat the bread. It doesn't make me feel bloated, but the bread at home must be somehow different. Maybe it's different, but also you're different. You're in a different frame of mind when you're on holiday and you're eating and you're chewing your food as you look at the lovely vista and you're just feeling more relaxed, and that's affecting your digestion.
This stuff matters more than people think. When I really don't, pretty much don't drink anymore. But when I did, I used to remember that I'd go on holiday and a glass of red wine would affect my sleep in the UK, or, I'd feel a bit groggy the next day. But I found when I was on holiday, I could have a glass or two with dinner and I felt nothing.
Yeah.
I thought, this is stress. This is there's no stress load on my life. I'm sort of chilling with my wife and my kids, and there's a beach. Yeah. So it's not bothering me. But if your life is chronically overly busy, you're stressed out the whole time, not only are you going to get sick more, or potentially, you're going to be able to not tolerate various things. You're not going to be able to manage those insults as well, right?
Exactly. I call it the food prison. I see so many people who are so stressed about eating the perfect diet that's just eroding their health. Never mind what they're eating being helpful. But I guess, you asked me earlier about what I do to manage my stress, and I think it's still my learning curve, but it's just on my radar now that I'm always experimenting. I'm learning how to say no. I think having boundaries was one of the biggest things I learned as an adult. Why are we not teaching kids this in school? And saying no is okay. And there's a time and a place for projects. If I want to get involved, and it can't be now because that compromises my time as a mother, or my time spent with family, or my time just, being on my own or doing the things that nurture my day, then I have to say no and let go of that. And I guess that's the catharticism of writing, or some ways of, putting a narrative to what's stressing us out has a release to it. And that you can feel that, like a big physiological sigh that your body is making when you're like, okay. And once the decision's made, you move on from it. I've said no to that. It's sad, and I wish I could say yes, but I don't think about it the next day when I've moved on and other things are,
It's very freeing, actually. It's something I've struggled with for years, and I'm getting much better at it, but it feels good. Yeah. Half the time I used to say yes to stuff, and then I would just be stressed out. Why did I say yes? I've got to do this. I've committed now. They've started advertising it. They don't. And I'm getting much better at nipping it in the bud at source. Yes. But it's taken a lot of work.
Oh yeah, I had to learn the hard way. Yeah. But I started feeling like I was doing everything badly. And when you start to feel like you're being a bad parent, probably I wasn't, but in my mind I wasn't doing what I wanted to do. And that, I think, with my kids, that had to be a firm line that I couldn't ever cross again.
Wow. Now, you mentioned eating, and you said that, there's some studies that our immune system operates differently if we're eating in company, feeling joy, feeling happy. That reminds me of something else I read in your book about, it's something to do with, you were giving a list of strategies to people, but it was about, walking whilst listening to music. It was about putting two senses in together. I found really interesting. Could you expand on that at all?
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. So this was data that was generated in the 1980s. There's some scientists who were trying to disprove research that had come out of Russia around that time about conditioning. So the classical example of conditioning is Pavlov's dogs. Most people will be aware of that. But these experiments they had done where they had looked to try and condition the immune system. And so these scientists were like, this can't be right. We're going to redo the experiments much more stringently and see if it is really what it makes out to be. Can you condition your immune system with various rituals and routines? And what they did was they used an animal model experiment, and they gave the animals a sweet solution to drink, and one group got the sweet solution that also had a particular chemical inside it that would modulate antibody responses. So they could measure the antibody responses in the blood and see if that there was an effect happening, some kind of readout, tangible piece of data that they could observe. So the mice were given this sugar solution with this chemical for a period of time. And after a while, when they just gave the sugar solution on its own, they got the same effect happening to the immune system. So it's kind of like a placebo effect. Wow. It's like you expect something, the mouse expected this effect to take place in its body on some kind of subconscious level, because it was so used to that happening that the effect happened anyway, even without the chemical present to actually cause the modulation to the immune system. And people have been scratching around to try and understand the mechanism. And I think the best we've come up with is the placebo effect. Like it's there's some part of us that we don't quite understand that embodies things. And when there's a response expected, that the biology changes and we can start to pair things together. So what you're referring to in the book is like the kind of little stress relieving rituals, like, you know, playing your favorite music whilst you're doing something like taking a nice bath, or having a particular scent being in the room while you're doing something else. And eventually then you just can play that music and you start to feel the same relaxed feeling that you do when you're in a nice warm bath, even without taking the bath.
Yeah, you know, it makes me think about, you know, if your home is or has been a stressful place, then, you know, that it kind of works that you may come into that and your body may start to almost, the immune system might sense that and go, okay, this is a stressful place, and react even if nothing stressful happens. But then you could also flip it. And, you know, I'm a huge fan of ritual and sort of daily practices that even if they only take 5 minutes, they can be very powerful. And I think when I hear that, I think of a morning routine, and I think, what if someone, you know, can design their ideal morning routine? Let's say it was 5-10 minutes, you know, a bit of maybe a minute or two of breathing, you know, 3 or 4 minutes of some light movement practice. And then let's say 5 minutes of reading a positive book. For example, I mean, that's, you know, I in the stress solution, I write about the 3 M's of a morning routine: mindfulness, movement, and mindset. I think you can create one that lasts an hour. You can create one that lasts 5 minutes. But the point I'm trying to make is, if someone started doing that in the same room, let's say they lit a candle in the room, did that even on a day when they're a little bit busy or they can't quite switch off, and they just, you know, sat there with their coffee with the candle on. Maybe that will also condition their immune system the other way and go, hey, things are okay because he's got the candle on. I don't know. It's quite empowering.
Smell, all the senses kind of integrating. So it might be a particular scent that you're burning. There might be a particular song or playlist that you always play when you're doing those activities for your morning routine. And then the morning you wake up and you're just tired and you don't want to do your movement. You just want to sit and enjoy a tea, but you're in that room with that space, and you still may be reaping the benefits of the meditation and the movement that you would normally do. And I think routine, as a human being, we just seem to be anchored by routines. For me, especially becoming a mother, it's been hugely important. So much so that now I can buffer the lack of routine more, because I can circle back to a really strong routine that I've built over time. And I think when we went into lockdown this year, everything kind of got off kilter, and we're living in a building site basically at the moment. So
that's stressful, right?
It's stressful. The routine is shot. It's really done a number on us. But I think having been someone who needs routine, particularly as a bit of a stress head, it didn't take long for us to find a new rhythm being at home, and that's anchoring. I think that's.
I love the way you the way you say certain things. You said, we can build a routine, like you can build your immune system.
Yeah.
It's a very empowering word.
Yeah.
Build means we can do that, right?
Yes.
It doesn't mean it's fixed.
Exactly.
We've got some agency over that.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, as I mentioned right at the start, this is, day one in the new studio.
Yeah.
And Gareth, who's videoing and sitting there in the corner, we've been talking about, how do we create a stress-free space that allows a really deep, authentic, vulnerable conversation to happen.
Yeah.
And, it's not quite ready yet. Bringing plants in is one thing, we're going to probably have a candle on or some sort of, a nice scent.
Yeah.
My dream is, because this podcast is all about authentic conversation. It's not interviews, it's conversation. I want someone like you to walk in and within, I almost want to program it so that people feel calm and they want to open up and actually, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think you've done a really good job already. But also I think what you give off as a person really helps. So the way people's eyes feel relaxed, when we're angry, we narrow our eyes, or if we're feeling quite negative or stressed. And then we pick that up when we're sort of reading the body language. Yeah. And so if somebody has a sort of relaxed disposition, that's going to be interpreted by the other person and make them feel at ease as well.
And interpreted by our immune systems.
Yes, exactly. As this is a safe environment. It's all about all of those millions of inputs that are going in every minute of every day, and our immune systems reading those, shaping and responding.
If you enjoyed that conversation, I think you are going to love the one that I had with Professor Tim Spector, all about foods. It's right there. So give it a click and let me know what you think.
If you snack a couple of hours before a meal, your metabolic response to that meal is poorer than if you didn't snack.
Okay, just say that again, because I think that's really important.